All right. Good morning. And it's kind of a gloomy morning this morning in Boston, but we know that's going to get turned around. Um, we're so excited to have with us Dr. Pamela Ruth Madison of New York City. We're so happy to have you here today. And as folks are joining, if folks want to add in the chat, if you have read Megan's books. I'm sure she would love to hear the feedback. So as we're talking this morning, it'd be great for folks to share how you are using all the incredible content that Megan is writing. But Megan, our first question for all 930 callers is for you to tell us a little bit about you and how you came to be in your current role.
What a great question. And good morning, everyone. It is such an honor to share some digital space with you all on a Monday morning, a very important Monday morning in October. I started my career in early childhood education as an assistant in a Waldorf school in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I grew up in Michigan. I'm a Midwesterner. And then after I graduated from the University of Michigan, I became a lead teacher in a Head Start program in Chicago, the Carol Robertson Center for Learning, if anybody knows the Chicago early childhood landscape. And in the classroom, kids had really good questions about what I now understand to be systemic racism, and class inequality and gender stereotypes. But even though I had a fancy, shiny master's degree in early childhood education, I didn't really have the language, or I didn't have the confidence or feel like I had the permission to talk about those things directly with young children and partner with their families to figure out what could we do to change the things in our society that were unfair. So maybe naively, I thought if I moved to the East Coast, I moved to Boston. I started a PhD program at Brandeis University. I thought all the smart folks on the East Coast might teach me what I need to know to be able to engage in this work. And you all might not be surprised. The folks in the ivory tower didn't have all of the answers. But they did have access to a lot of resources. I was exposed to critical race theory and feminist thought for the first time. And then I started doing professional development workshops for early childhood educators, mostly focusing on race, gender, and sexuality as a consultant with a couple different organizations. And through that work, I was really inspired to kind of learn alongside other early childhood educators about what we could do. And then when the pandemic hit, all the workshops got canceled. I was stuck at home in this home office, unsure what I was going to do other than twiddle my thumbs and worry. And Jessica Rowley, a librarian who works for the Brooklyn Public Library, reached out and said, "Hey, I think there's a gap in the children's literature. And I think if the two of us put our heads together, maybe we can start to fill that gap." So now here we are, 8 books later in the First Conversation series. And I'm just so excited to get to share those books with you all today and continue this journey of learning from and alongside early childhood advocates.
And I first met Megan when we both were interviewing to be on the NAUIC board. And the way that worked is you were in a group interview, and my group was me, Megan, and it turns out Dina Castro, who's now at Boston University. And the three of us made it to the NAUIC board. Megan sat in the first seat for students on the NAYC board, and it was a change in the NAYC bylaws to make sure that we were thinking about students. And I think Megan did an incredible job. Megan, can you talk a little bit about your PhD experience and kind of what you learned, what you focused on, and kind of your experience with that?
Sure. Amy, such thoughtful questions. First thing Monday morning. So my PhD is in social policy, and I focused on early childhood workforce policy. I came into the field, that Head Start position I had was through Teach for America. So I'm a millennial. I was born in 1987. I was brought into this field at a time when there were particular things happening in the education reform movement. And I was one of very few teachers of color in my TFA cohort. And the way it had rolled out, Chicago had just implemented their universal pre-K system. And so there was a big demand for teachers, and there was a big demand for teachers who were quote unquote highly qualified. And that was written into federal law. And TFA had lobbied to make it so that TFA teachers would be considered highly qualified. So I was paid a Chicago public school teacher salary, which now, even not adjusting for inflation, $40,000 is not enough, is not livable compensation for anyone. But it was twice as much as my co-teachers were. Mostly women of color, some of whom were sending their own children to the center where we worked, who had deep connections to the community that we were serving, who had years of ongoing professional development and certification in early childhood education. They were making half as much as me while they were teaching me as we were going. And so I was like, something's off. Like, I get the policy logic, but in terms of how it's actually being implemented on the ground in classrooms, this doesn't seem to be working, which in a lot of ways is why I so admire you, Amy, and the creation of this call, because I think we solve those policy problems by getting people who are on the ground in direct conversation with the people who are making decisions about their lives. So I came to grad school to try to figure that out. What would it look like to create early childhood workforce policy that was truly reflective of our racial justice goals and values? And I ran for the NACCE governing board on an explicitly Black Lives Matter platform. I came with a mission to make sure racial justice was a priority at the governing board level. And I feel so lucky to have had allies and champions and mentors like Dina, like Amy. And even though I was, as a student governing board member, I was only on the board for 2 years. But in that time, we revised the developmentally appropriate practice position statement and added a piece around context that I think is really critical to understanding what developmentally appropriate practice is. We wrote the first ever position statement on advancing equity in early childhood education. We revised the professional standards and competencies that are used to accredit early childhood teacher preparation programs and incorporated in there pieces around professionalism, activism, racial justice. So I feel really proud of that time and very grateful to have gotten to serve the profession alongside amazing people like Amy and Dina.
It was an incredible time. It still is an incredible time here. So Megan, as you think about the work that you've done, and I love the way you framed it of thinking about COVID, and that was the origin of this call was, the third week or second week of March, where we came together. We strongly share your belief that the people who are closest to the work have to be the people who come up with the solutions. And many of us are early educators. So we use a continuum that if you're a number one, you work directly with children and families every day. You're a two, you sometimes work directly with children and families. And you're a three, you don't work directly with children and families, but you have a vested interest. And you can see sometimes in our participant list, people keep their numbers. As early childhood educators, so many of us have thought about these conversations and your observations and how are we working with families to have these conversations that are usually kid driven, right? Something will happen in circle time, or there'll be a moment in dramatic play. And then sometimes you'll hear like, well, maybe they might be too young to talk about some of these issues. So can you talk a little bit about where that sits in your continuum as you think about writing these books?
Yeah, I mean, maybe the core of developmentally appropriate practice, as I've understood it, is that there's no universal one size fits all for every child, right? The first thing we take into consideration is what we know about an individual child. The second thing we take into consideration is what we know about children in general. And then the third piece is context. So these books were developed in conversation with early childhood educators about things that were coming up really frequently. So right now, in conversations I'm having with early childhood educators, actually yesterday I did a full day professional learning session with some early childhood educators, and knowing that tomorrow, which is now today, is October 7th, something that was really on teachers' minds is how we address what's happening in Israel and Palestine in our classrooms. In New York City, We have a very large Jewish population, a large Israeli population. We also have a very large Palestinian population. So there are people who are directly impacted by what's happening in Israel and Palestine in our classrooms and programs here in New York City. And we also have all children being impacted by the broader conversation. So some examples are kids on the playground chanting, free, free Palestine, free, free, free Palestine. So teachers need to know, how do they engage in those conversations? Because I think you're right, Amy. The kids are often bringing them up. We have a responsibility to initiate these conversations as well. And also to pretend that we can ignore them just doesn't hold up. The kids are bringing them up every single day.
And so tell us kind of about the writing journey, about kind of working with co-authors. How's that, because there's so many books out there, but I think the gap is really important to talk about.
Yeah, so I was doing professional development workshops around how to talk about race and racism in the classroom, mostly through an organization called the Center for Racial Justice in Education. And at the end of almost every workshop, teachers would ask us, do we have recommended resources? And there were some. I would recommend A is for Activist, or Anti-Racist Baby, or Mary Hoffman's Amazing Grace, some classics. And there wasn't exactly what teachers were looking for, right? So Amazing Grace is a beautiful story. It's a narrative. I love the protagonist. And it focuses mostly on interpersonal racism, a child saying something biased to another child. And the teachers were like, but we just went through a whole PD around systemic or structural racism, institutional racism. How do I break that down and explain it to young children? I think the illustrations in A is for Activist or Anti-Racist Baby are gorgeous. And especially for pre-readers, the illustrations are the key. And also, I wanted to make a book where the illustrations reflected the same analysis that was being presented in the words, and that the words would be an opportunity for adults to start practicing talking about these big concepts in ways that young children can understand, but are not watered down. And I honestly didn't have examples of that growing up. I didn't have examples of that in my teacher preparation. It really came out of ongoing conversations with early childhood educators in professional learning workshops. And then we finally put it down on paper.
Excellent. And so where are you now in the process? What do you finished your dissertation? You became a doctor, was it last year or 2 years ago?
I know, time flies. I had a non-traditional process. I graduated, I became Dr. Megan in February.
Right.
Walked across the stage with the fancy hat in May. So it's still pretty fresh.
And what are you doing now, or what else do you want us to know about you and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, now I'm looking for a job. I'm consulting and I feel grateful to have that. So I'm okay financially, but my dream would be to have a full-time job, somewhere in the early childhood sector that uses my PhD and my training. And we've completed the series. The eighth book will be on disability and will come out in 2025. So we're finishing up the illustrations. But now that the series is kind of complete, my other job is to get out in the world and tell everybody about these books and answer the questions that you all have, and start to think about, what do teachers need beyond just the book? Do they need TikTok videos? Do they need examples? Do they need communities of practice? Do they need coaching? Do they need professional development? I don't know yet. So my job is to get out into the world, talk to people like you, and figure out what teachers need beyond just the books.
So kind of as we have time this morning, if folks could add to chat, we'll share that with Megan. Kind of as you think about this, what else would you need? What are you seeing? If you're an educator working directly with children and families, what do you need? How do you keep these conversations going? Lauren Cook added in the chat that my 4-year-old daughter came home from school last week saying she had a new classmate who was a girl and had a penis. I immediately shared being you with her teachers, which they appreciated greatly. Uh, yes, vote for communities of practice. Excellent.
Thank you.
And so, Megan, as you think about kind of where educators are sitting. They're sitting in their classrooms, they have the direct line to families. What are some questions or key concepts that you would hope that educators, I also love that you talk about confidence, because often educators know what to do, but sometimes that bridge to confidence and being the expert can be
Mm-hmm.
hard to establish, especially if you're a newer teacher. So
Mm-hmm.
what, in your experience and now what you have learned kind of through this process, what would your advice be?
Mm. Listen to children. Really listen. I was reminded of a story yesterday during our workshop. One of the books in the series is about grief. And it explains in developmentally appropriate language what death is. And it's a tough, one of the teachers said at my school, it's actually in our handbook that we're not allowed to talk about death. Which was a good reminder that not everyone in our field is comfortable having these conversations, and that discomfort sometimes manifests as policy. But the story that I was reminded of is I was working as a nanny, as a caregiver for a 4-year-old who was on the autism spectrum and had pretty advanced literacy and numeracy skills for his kind of chronological age. And so I would pick him up from preschool and we would walk to the library many days after school. And in New York City, there's plaques everywhere, like on the sides of buildings and things like that. And he would always want to stop and read the plaques. I was always so curious, like, why? And also a little bit annoyed, to be completely honest. I was like, we're trying to get from school to the library. We only have so much time. This is New York City. The culture is kind of hustle and bustle. Why are we always stopping and looking at the plaques? So I had to remind myself as an early childhood educator to really slow down, observe, and listen to what this kid was telling me. And when I really slowed down, it took probably at about a month to figure this out. He was looking at the birth date and the death date of the people on the plaques and calculating in his head how old they
Wow.
were when they died, because he was really worried that his parents and his grandparents were going to die. Someone said, people die when they get old. And so with only that limited information, he was really scared about the
Right.
people that he loves most and when they were going to die. And so he was like on an independent quest to figure this out. And I think a book like Grief is an intervention into that and saying that kids, they don't have to alone worry and try to figure it out, that we as safe, loving, and trusted adults who are in relationship with them are brave enough to talk about it openly and honestly with them so that they don't have to be alone with their big questions and their big feelings.
I love that story. I think Debbie Lee Keenan was on the 9:30 call in August, and when she had her screening of her Families Embracing Anti-Bias Values at Bunker Hill Community College here in Boston. And there was a family meeting and grief came up.
Mm,
And a mom had said that her partner had died, but she did not feel included. Grief was not included in their anti-bias statement. And
mm,
the families kind of took over it turned out to be a 3-hour parent meeting, but
wow.
it was so significant because she said, my family is not represented in what you're talking about. Even though they had kind of gone to great pains to think about inclusive, they were doing that work. So I so appreciate that. I think it's something that we don't, as adults, sometimes know how to process. So we struggle like many of these topics.
Mhm.
Okay, there's some chat. So love our skin. I don't have African American children in my program, so I use a doll. Yes. Follow-up question is that how to not gatekeep our profession while healthily using high professional standards.
What a great question. I wish there was an easy answer and I wish that I knew it. I can share from my perspective what I try to do. Um, so for example, during yesterday's workshop, it was a conference workshop. So it was educators coming from all over the city, many different programs, and in very different places on their professional journey. There was one person who had just started an undergraduate program in early childhood education, one person who just finished their master's, one person who's been in the field for 20 years and been in their exact same early childhood classroom for more than 15. So, people, a whole spectrum of experience. And so when I kind of anticipating that, what I did in terms of my pedagogy was to bring, I wish I could show you. If I turn around the computer, there's a big stack of nonfiction books I can hold up. That's right. And these are all the books that I read in grad school that informed the writing of First Conversations. So I brought them with me to the workshop and I set them out just like you'd set out for early young children, a bunch of different nonfiction texts, and let them be drawn to whatever they're interested in. And everybody had some free reading time to pick a text that they were interested in and that was at their level. We did free reading, and then we came back and we shared what we learned from what we read. So it's, in some ways, it's like creating enough openness where everyone has an entry point, but also not watering it down, saying we as adult learners all have a right to like critical race theory and high academic theory. It shouldn't just be available when you go to graduate school or if you get into a PhD program. Everybody deserves access to this kind of information, and we all deserve support to figure out how to make meaning of that and apply it to our practice.
And then I added your your site, and then if you're comfortable as we approach the end of the card to include an email address if people want to get in touch. Megan, I'm a Head Start home visitor in Martha's Vineyard, and one topic I'm interested in is how to build or create that safe space to discuss equity topics among families and children. And then Tom Weber shared, Megan, thank you. This is inspiring and challenging in the best way. So really inspiring work and thinking. What strategies have you developed, learned to help those who may fear those topics, generally in education around these topics, specifically to see their value and necessity without feeling threatened, asking for a friend, okay, asking for a nation, really. So, I mean, similar questions about building safe space, not to have people feel threatened.
Yes, I love these questions. One strategy I use is community agreements. There's a list of community agreements that I've developed alongside my mentor, Ijima Jordan, and that we've been using for about 10 years now. And kind of no matter what the list you use or the process you use to develop them, we kind of call it, as a facilitator, you create the container. You have to set the tone. So the way it looks like in my early childhood classroom yesterday is I made it beautiful and inviting so that when teachers came into the room, they knew I was looking forward to them. There was a handout packet already on their seat. When they came in the door, I learned their name and how to pronounce it. When they sat at their seat, they got their materials, and we were playing beautiful music that was culturally relevant. All of those little things are a part of creating the space where people feel like they really matter to you, and not just to you as the teacher, but they matter to one another. And then we spent the whole first half of the day building relationships and introducing ourselves to one another. We shared stories about our connection to land. We did rounds of introductions. We drew self-portraits and shared them with one another. That was the whole first half of the day. It wasn't until after lunch did I pull out these books and we start, digging into the content. And I think that's really true when you're working with young children and when you're working with families. Building those relationships and building them deep enough that they're able to hold the feelings that will come up. We can't avoid confusion, rage, grief, discomfort. All those are natural human reactions to thinking about these topics. And so our question is like, not how do we avoid those feelings, but how do we create a safe enough container where those feelings are welcome and that they're not going to break our relationships.
Thank you, Megan. And I think so much of what you talked about is kind of what we've seen on this 9:30 call, a community that's been kind of focused on love first, which we often say is not to be mistaken for weakness or for softness, but creating those conditions for people to feel. Somebody asked us if you needed a crisis to create a 9:30 call. And our communications director says, isn't there always a crisis in early ed? Like, so many people are living in crisis all the time. So to have a half an hour every day where we can come and be in community, and to have folks like you join us this morning, Megan, I'm so grateful. for you, for the work that you're doing, and for your kind of willingness to share what you have learned, and your incredible guidance for folks who are doing this work every day. We are so happy that we have you here this morning, and I will send you the chat. Before folks sign off, we also have some exciting policy news. So I'm going to turn it quickly to Teresa Jordan from the Children's Investment Fund to share an opportunity that's happening right now. Thanks. Thank you, Megan. Please continue to show love and appreciation in the chat for Megan.
Thank you, Amy.
Great. Yes. 2 seconds. So for those of you who don't know who we are, I'm Teresa Jordan, and Kira Wilkie is my colleague who is on as well. And at the Children's Investment Fund, what we do is we provide financing, training, and technical assistance to nonprofit organizations that are planning capital improvements in their spaces. So I just wanted to announce, and Kira will drop in the link in the chat the links to these 3 capital programs that we have going. We co-manage the EEOST and EEC PCG capital grant programs with EEC. We'll be offering 3 capital grant programs. And the first one is for nonprofit center-based organizations, and their grants between $200,000 to $500,000 for capital improvements. Applications are due December 12th. The second is for-profit center-based organizations, and those grants are between $200,000 to $500,000 as well. And those applications are due December 12th. And then the third grant program is for large grants up to $1 million for nonprofit center-based organizations that are planning to do major capital projects like new construction or substantial renovation of their existing space. So those grants are up to $1 million, and those applications are due December 16th. But all of that will be in the chat. So if folks are interested in applying, please call us as well. Email us if you have any questions about anything or about your project that you're proposing. We'd love to talk with you first before you apply. Thanks, Amy.
Thanks so much, Teresa. And we are going to have kind of since the 9:30 call has expanded its outreach, we're going to have a 101 of the Children's Investment Fund in the next few weeks so folks can learn about it. Here's a great example of how the policy is following people's kind of needs. We need capital funding for folks to improve their spaces. So we're excited to think about all these opportunities, how they fit into everyone's day-to-day life. One more thank you to Megan. We often say the 9:30 call is the inspiration that we didn't know we needed. I was pretty sure we would get it this morning, and I think folks will join me in thanking you for that, and for the work that you're going to continue to do. So you're always welcome to come back on the 9:30 call. If you have questions, if you have inspiration, please come back and join us anytime. Okay, we will see everybody tomorrow morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Have a great day.
Have a great day, everybody. Thank you,
Thanks, Megan.
Amy.